Political analyst James M. Dorsey is joining us now to discuss Syria's ongoing political transition, the pursuit of justice for war crimes, and the broader implications of international actions in the conflict. Good to see you, James.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Jamila.
Thank you. Now, what challenges does Syria face in achieving a stable and inclusive political transition, and what role should the international community play in this process?
The challenges are multiple. Start with the issues of the Kurds in the north, the Israeli attacks and decimation of the Syrian military, the issue of transnational justice, and of course, last but by no means least, the need to rehabilitate a traumatized society and reconstruct a shattered economy. What the international community at this point can do, and particularly the United States and the United Nations for that matter, is lift at least some of the sanctions that were imposed on Syria. Syria is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. They were imposed to isolate the Assad regime, to lift some of those sanctions so that the new government can start the process of reconstruction. That would also encourage the rebels to fulfill what the international community would like them to see doing. That includes also the Arab states, which is to build an inclusive government that includes the minorities and guarantees minority rights, that adheres to a rule of law, which means basically also regulating the meting out of justice to former Assad regime officials. So the opportunities that the international community has are vast. So far, we've only seen words. We haven't seen deeds. And in fact, in the case of the United States, what we've seen is Congress extend the sanctions rather than either let them expire or suspend some of them.
Now, how can justice and accountability be pursued for the atrocities reported in Syria's detention centers, and what impact would this have on reconciliation efforts?
I think there's several issues here. One is the rebels have, in a sense, tried to reach out to the former regime, in the sense of you saw contacts between the former regime and the incoming government in terms of a smooth transition and handover of power. You've seen the amnesty for everybody in the Syrian military that was not involved in torture, do not have blood on their hands, at least not Syrian blood on their hands. And but on the other hand, you've also seen a situation in which, in essence, the former regime has vanished. It's gone into thin air. We know that Bashar al-Assad is in Moscow. Some other senior officials reportedly have made their way to Beirut. But by and large, the operatives of the regime, and certainly of the security forces, seem to have vanished. They haven't turned in their weapons. They still presumably have access to funds. So that's a sort of a threat lurking in the dark. And the question will be, and in terms of reconciliation, I think that it's striking a balance between, on the one hand, bringing to justice the politically responsible officials in the regime, as well as the first line or the major line of people who tortured, killed, but then also to somewhere draw the line so that you strike a balance between reconciliation and fulfilling a sense of wanting to see justice.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the future of Syria. In the beginning, we've seen many criticize al-Jolani, and perhaps he did grab attention to his drastic change in leadership. But if we also look at the transitional government, Mohammed al-Bashir also showed progress let us remind our viewers that right after the HTS forces captured Damascus and later the new prime minister held his first press conference, behind him was two flags, one being the new Syrian flag and the other being an Islamic flag depicting the Shahada. But what happened next was the Syrian people reacted to this, disapproving the Islamic symbology, citing their fears regarding having had their fair share of sectarian wars in the past. However, we see that al-Bashir listened to his people's voice, and in his next public speech, he removed the Islamic flag and kept the new flag, the Free Syrian flag. So I want you to analyze al-Julani and al-Bashir and the Syrian people's will to change.
Well, I think this is al-Julani's predicament. His is a history of jihadism. He was an al-Qaeda operative. He was an Islamic State operative. He has a $10 million US bounty on his head for being a jihadist. He's a designated terrorist in the United States and the United Nations. Now, having said all of that, fact of the matter is that over the last 9 years, he's disavowed jihadism. He has not disavowed his deeply held conservative religious beliefs. There is a degree of a track record in the former rebel stronghold of Idlib and the way it was administered. That track record is checkered. He has indeed, as you've pointed out, shown that he's sensitive to criticism, that he's responding to that. The question really is how much of this is performance and how much of this is real. Al-Julani understands that he needs to put that jihadist, the perception of his jihadist background to rest, that in order to get the kind of financial and economic and political support he needs, both domestically and internationally, to reconstruct Syria, he is going to have to allay these fears. The Islamic flag is an issue that on the one hand divides the Sunni Muslim community, which is the majority of the population, not because necessarily they're opposed to Islam, but for the very reason you mentioned. They don't want to see further sectarian policies. And of course, the minorities who constitute 30% of the population, and maybe somewhat also more sensitive, because many of them were supportive of the Assad regime because they feared a conservative Islamist form of government.
Now, what does the discovery of mass graves imply about the scale of violence under the Assad regime, and how can these findings shape the global response to war crimes in Syria?
I mean, what we're finding and what we're discovering is horrendous. No more horrendous, of course, than for those families and relatives of people who disappeared or were known to have been arrested, to discover not only whether or not they're alive, but if they're not alive, on how horrible potentially the circumstances were in which they died. That's an issue that you have to strike a balance. It's going to be up to the Syrians to demonstrate that they are capable of bringing people to justice with due diligence and with proper trials, rather than have an international court deal with this. So I think in the first instance, this is an issue for the Syrians, and only if the Syrians and the new government cannot handle it for whatever reason would you want to look at alternatives. But I think there's no question that there is a need to administer justice, but to do so fairly, transparently, and equitably.
Now, I also want to ask you, we've seen some Western media headlines saying that the minority populations, such as Christians and Shias, are scared of the new administrations. administration. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think they should be scared or not?
I think the jury is out. I think that many of them also welcome the change. I mean, their choice for Assad was not a wholeheartedly ideological change, support. It was support because they feared the other side. Now, what we've seen, and that's been acknowledged by US officials, Arab officials, United Nations officials, we've seen the rebels say the right things. We've seen al-Jolani and Hayat Tahrir try to reassure minorities. It's going to take time for minorities to feel reassured, and the proof is going to be in the pudding. It's going to be in what the new government does and what Hayat Tahrir does, rather than in what it says.
Now, lastly, how do Israel's military actions in Syria impact regional stability, and what diplomatic measures could de-escalate tensions and prioritize civilian safety?
I mean, it seems to me that if you look at the scale of the Israeli operations in Syria, this goes far beyond addressing what are immediate concerns, whether that is chemical weapons stockpiles, whether that is shutting off transfer routes for weapons to Hezbollah, or via Jordan to Palestinians in the West Bank. This is about emasculating militarily Syria. And I think what underlines that or underlies that strategy is a recognition that if Israel's not willing to compromise on the Golan Heights, which it occupied in 1967 during the Middle East War, annexed in 1981, and then saw U.S. President, now President-elect Donald Trump in his first term, endorse the annexation. If it's not willing to compromise on that, there is not going to be a formal relationship with Syria, because there's no way that any Syrian government, particularly not this government, can make surrender on the claim of Syrian sovereignty over all of its territory. What can the international community do? Not much. The one country that can do something is the United States, in that it reins in Israel on Syria, and notes that there are other pathways that Israel can pursue to try and address its security concerns. To be fair, so reportedly that's to some degree already happening, not so much as on the part of the United States, but there are reports that Jordan has been facilitating talks or indirect contacts between Israel and Hayat Tahrir, particularly over the issues of weapons smuggling.
James M. Dorsey, thank you for joining NewsHour, and thank you for your analysis.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.